Hello, I'm Valerie Piet of IOHR TV. Around the world, both prison inmates and prison workers are at risk of coronavirus. They're all in close proximity to each other, unable to practice social distancing, and among the prisoner population there are high instances of underlying medical conditions, a lack of medical care and poor hygiene. Worldwide, only 5% of prisoners have been released or given furlough during the pandemic, and of those, many were already in pre-detention. In the United States, over 40,000 prisoners have tested positive for the coronavirus, with 300 deaths recorded. At least 495 other prisoners have died of related causes, while more than 8,400 prison staff members have tested positive. Only 34 deaths have been publicly recorded. In the UK, identified 4,000 prisoners for early release and then only released 57 people before dropping the scheme in May. Today, we're joined by Sir Malcolm Evans, who is the chairperson of the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. More than anybody else in the world, Sir Malcolm has visited prisons and detention centres to really understand what the conditions are that prisoners are being kept under. Sir Malcolm, it's a pleasure to have you with us on IOHR TV, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about these very important issues.
Do you think the work of the SPT can impact from the bottom upwards to improve working practices positively?
One of the things that we are always looking for are to make sure there are proper ratios of staff to detainees, to make sure that they've got the personnel who are adequately trained and with the correct facilities to be able to deal appropriately with those in detention. Are they getting the right support? Have they had the right training? Have they got the right expertise and educational background? To give a blatant example, in one country that had best remain nameless, there was an enormous problem with form filling, registrations, record keeping. Well, obviously this is pretty fundamental to a well-managed place. But before one gets too critical, I'm afraid to say it was a country in which there were literacy problems within the country as a whole, and a high proportion of those working in these sectors simply could not read and write. And if you have people who cannot read and write, then understandably they're not going to be spending their time filling in records. And it's things like this to make sure that the people have got the skill sets and the support to do what is expected of them. And in some countries, of course, that also then goes down to make sure they're paid properly for the jobs that they're being asked to do. Otherwise, it can easily feel a culture of corruption where there is an expectation almost built into the system that those responsible for the running of the system will exploit their position for financial gain simply because they need to do so, because they are not being paid, because their salaries are being siphoned off by others, etc., higher up the chain. And so trying to analyse, what is the actual driver of the ill treatment. Sometimes it is just cruelty and sadism, but in many other situations it isn't. There's a whole host of other factors that are feeding into what's going on, and it can take time to unpick that and then find out what the right sort of interventions are in order to try to address the problems.
Malcolm, do you see protection from COVID-19 as a human right, and what can be done to keep prisoners and staff safe at this time?
Anyone in detention has got the same rights as regards healthcare as anyone in the general community. When one is the equivalence of care is one of the fundamental principles concerning healthcare in prisons, and if measures are put in place to protect the health of persons within the community as a whole, in terms of access to access to healthcare, then those in detention ought to be able to access it on a similar basis. The reality, as we know, is that is so often not in fact the case, and one of the things that needs to be focused on. And once again, one of the effects of this pandemic may be to shed a little light on the inadequacies of the provisions in many prison systems in many parts of the world in this regard. So I think it's not a question of how far can we go. It is a question of recognizing recognising that those in detention in this regard have exactly the same rights as anybody else, and they need protecting and respecting too.
It seems a contradiction to think that in the midst of the quarantine lockdown, you might actually be getting better unhindered access directly to prisoners.
Whilst in the past there have been, issues concerning, security of such communication, well, we all know that many of the social media providers are moving over to end encryption, and so actually these are pretty secure means of communication in a way that possibly, they weren't a third-party intervention or more so, and so this does open up a whole new range of possibilities of the way in which people can engage with people in detention. Also, of course, about what is in the past, one has often been told that it's not possible to allow detainees access to phones, video communications, etc., etc. Well, all of a sudden, when it became necessary to lock people up on almost permanent lockdown within lockdowns, in many countries, they suddenly found it was perfectly possible to give people enhanced access to communications and in some, although their freedom of movement is more restrained, their freedom of communication with people outside the prison is probably greater than it was before, and so on. And this opens up a whole new prospect if this is, taken on board, about learning, educational opportunities, new social opportunities, new rehabilitative opportunities and programs and things of this nature. There's a lot that can be taken out when some of the traditional restraints, if I can use that word, on what could or couldn't be done within a detention environment have been challenged by the experience over the last few weeks.
What guidance has the SPT given to help states now and for the next pandemic?
In terms of what the SPT has done, quite early on, we issued an advice, as we call them, to both national preventive mechanisms and states on steps and measures that we thought they ought to consider taking in order to certainly to address overcrowding, but also a range of other issues that, particularly in terms of access to the outside world, to try to mitigate the effects of the draconian lockdown and regimes and the removal of facilities that were being put in place to enforce social distancing in prisons, knowing as we do what the psychological effects of these were going to be on many detainees, particularly when they were being forcibly locked down in what were anyway horribly overcrowded conditions. One was sort of insisting that they distance in places where you would often have 1 or 2 square meters per person to live in on a permanent basis. The idea of keeping a meter or 2 apart from persons where they are literally sleeping like sardines on the floor is grotesque.
So have states positively responded to your measures?
I'm afraid to say what we have found in many cases is that they have been swift to bring in the restrictive measures, but the measures of mitigation in terms of improved access through telephone, video, etc., have been rather slow in coming. And in the youth justice estate, for example, there have been swift removals of education provision, but not necessarily the promised mitigations in place to address that, and so on and so forth.
What about the states where there's no representation? For example, we've just written to the Special Rapporteur for Iran requesting assistance for dual nationals, such as Dr. Jadali, who's been tortured and is in need of furlough. What can be done?
I think part of the, certainly I have to accept, as a committee, we are at the end of the day limited by, the terms of our convention. We can only directly work and intervene, in countries which are a party to it, which is only about half the countries in the world are in, which means that about half of them are not. And that is a huge concern to us. But as you rightly said, in the international system, there are other mechanisms that can intervene, such as the UN Special Rapporteur, the Committee Against Torture itself, but also there's the whole array of technical expertise, both within the Office of the High Commissioner, but within the other specialist branches of the UN and other international organizations, UNDP, UNICEF, OHCA, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Health Organization, and so on. part of it, I think, is also sensitizing those bodies to the human rights dimensions and angles into the work that they are doing. As I mentioned earlier, many of the problems are not, they're human rights problems because that's what they create, but they are often a product of a range of other problems: bribery, corruption, lack of transparency in governance and oversight, etc., etc. The problem, of course, is that the human rights lens is receding from view. Fewer and fewer of these bodies and organisations seem to take up matters from a human rights perspective, and I think that's is a great problem. Increasingly other important agendas, climate change, obviously, but within the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., these rightly have a huge traction. Why is it that the commitments concerning human rights, which have been around so very much longer, no longer seem to have that bite or traction to drive changing of behaviour? I think we all need to think about that.
The coronavirus disrupted the April 2020 UN Working Review. Many of the requests have been around streamlining working processes and practices. Can you tell me a bit more about it?
This is a very important and delicate moment at which we are balanced. The process of what was called the 2020 review is still ongoing. Co-facilitators of the states have now been put in place, who will be coming forward with proposals. If I put back my hat of trying to be rather blunt from time to time, we all know that there are some states out there for whom the language of reform is little more than a vehicle for the language of neutering the effect of the system. And so things which are dressed up in terms of trying to make the system leaner, smarter, more efficient, more effective, easily swing over into how we can paralyze it practically in operation. We know this. We have seen it before. And money is the thing that, of course, regretfully, is the key driver here.
Sir Malcolm Evans, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your commitment to preventing torture around the world and steering the vital work of the SPT.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
From me, Valerie Piet, thank you for joining us on IOHR TV. Until next time.